All right, the recording is started. Welcome to the Intune and Azure Active Directory. Again, please mute yourself if you're not asking a question. Welcome to the Intune and the Azure AD panel with Q&A. Just real quick on the agenda, the purpose of this session is to answer questions from the field. I will say, while it's a great platform to provide feedback, it is not technical support, so let's try and keep that portion of it out of it. There will also be a voice of the customer session that will focus on just Azure Active Directory on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. So if you want to provide even more feedback around Azure Active Directory and the deep identity pieces of that, that would be a great session to provide feedback as well. This is our panel today. I have not checked to see. It looked like we had a quorum of people on there, and I'm sure people will come and go. But from the Intune team, we got Andy Fu, Daniel Gerrity, Carlos Brito, and Ravi Ashok. From the Azure Active Directory team, we have Doug Kirschner, Ravi Vennapusa. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too much. From the specialist team, which is the Microsoft education field, we have Richard Balsley and Corey Lee. And from the customer panel, we got Brian Arkills from the University of Washington, James Morris from the University. Of course, I had a typo there, the University or Washington. No, University of Washington, UW. Keith Sumlar from the University of Illinois, and Andrew Sanders from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I guess at this point we shall, Philip's already taken care of that for me, but recorded sessions and slides, these slides won't be there, but recorded sessions will be available on the agenda site, the same site that you're going to get the calendar invites and the links to the live meetings. As the recordings are made available, they'll be posted there. And at this point, we'll open it up to any questions, any comments from the panel. If somebody wants to ask a question, again, please raise your hand and come off mute. I know, Phil, you want the slides. That's nice. Sounds like somebody's not on mute. So is there a question? Don't make this 45 minutes of awkward silence. All right, I guess I'll start off by asking the first question if I can find where my notes are. So I guess to the panel, is there anything on the roadmap to support hierarchies similar to AD in Azure AD Intune? And also, what is on the roadmap that might be available with signing in with Shibboleth on my Windows devices? I don't know if anybody from the panel would like to take those questions.
Sure, I could. This is Daniel Gerrity. I could take a first crack at the aspect around hierarchies. So this is something we are currently. I've been working with Doug, and we currently have active threads and conversations about how to manage some of the moved from on-prem group policy to managing device management policies with Intune in ways similar to the on-prem hierarchy structure. In that question, were you thinking of hierarchy mostly from the purpose of assigning policy, or were you thinking of hierarchy in other contexts, such as assigning different scopes for delegated administrators and RBAC or other workloads?
It's probably in both cases, honestly. Obviously, most customers want to be able to have that in there from assigning policies, but at the same time, they're using those a lot for assigning RBAC as well.
Absolutely. So I'll just throw it over to Doug. If there's anything you want to comment on the directory's perspective on RBAC and hierarchy, if there's anything you want to mention on the kind of go forward plan for being able to make nested hierarchies for admin delegation.
Yeah, and I think we're centering it around administrative units right now. So and the on-prem similar but not equivalent feature would be organizational units where you could have hierarchy constructed. So administrative units are a little bit different in that they allow you to construct essentially scopes of resources over which you can assign roles, and being able to, if you create those for a hierarchical organization, is something you can do today. In that you can create different administrative units for different layers of a hierarchy, and you can assign objects in the directory, such as users, groups, and soon to be devices, to different layers of that hierarchy. So if you have, a university level hierarchy and then a department level hierarchy, you can, create administrative units for the department, and well, the university would probably just be the tenant, but you could create, administrative units for individual classes or whatever. And then what you can't do yet, though, is you can't necessarily build a relationship between those admin units. So basically, you'd have to separately maintain, the members of each. And so what we're looking at is the ability to construct hierarchies such that those relationships between different levels of the hierarchy are enforced. So if you're, a member of an administrative unit, at one layer, you're also a member of an administrative unit at a higher layer. So if you assign a role over one level of your hierarchy, then any objects at any levels beneath that would be in the scope of your role as well. And then, as I think was alluded a little bit here, Daniel and I are also working on how do we make that work with Intune policy assignment, because in addition to there are a couple things about OUs that are different. One of them is the hierarchical structure, and the other one is the fact that devices could be a member of a single OU, whereas with administrative units, objects can be in multiple administrative units at once. And so how do we do that in a way that doesn't cause a bunch of policy conflicts? So we're still working out how that might look.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And today, Intune is mostly standardized on security groups in Azure AD for building hierarchy. As Doug mentioned, a device may be a member of multiple AUs. The same goes for security groups. It's the same device can be in as many arbitrary security groups as you please. But security groups do today support nesting, and Intune does support interpreting nested security groups for applying policy. So if I have assigned or deployed an app or a policy, device configuration or Wi-Fi profile at a parent group, and that parent group contains multiple child security groups, the parent's policy will be applied to the members of the child groups as well. The missing pieces, as Doug pointed out, would be around conflict resolution. So if I have conflicts between my parent and my child policy assignments, it depends on which type of policy that is. For compliance policy, Intune has hard-coded rules over what it considers more secure, and we will always resolve in favor of whatever's more secure, whether it's the parent's policy or the child's policy. For other policy types, Wi-Fi, VPN profiles, certificate deployments, usually we don't resolve the conflict automatically. Instead, we'll throw an error and notify the administrator that they need to sort out which policy they actually want to win. So something that we are very actively looking at right now is investments we can make to improve that in terms of actually being able to interpret the hierarchy for policy conflict resolution. And I noticed Andy put in the chat kind of an ad hoc poll. You can upvote Andy's first chat if hierarchies for delegation RBAC specifically is something your organization is interested in, needed. So that way that can help us give a sense. We've definitely heard lots of feedback on the policy side. But going back to the original question, Steve, I think the second half of the question mentioned something about Windows sign-in. I wasn't sure if I I heard that.
Yeah, it's especially in higher education, a lot of our customers are using Shibboleth as their IDP, and Shibboleth does not support WSFed. Windows login still requires WSFed. Is there going to be a method or a way for people to not have to basically stand up an ADFS server to daisy chain through to their Shibboleth environment in order to be able to do things like, you know, autopilot and Azure AD join and such?
Got it. I'm fortunately I'm not the right expert to speak to that. I don't know if there's someone from the directory on the identity side who might be able to speak to that in more detail.
Yeah, Daniel, this is Ravi from the identity team. I can speak to that.
Sure.
So yes, this is something that we've considered. We have a preview feature today that we explicitly recommend not to use in production. This is web sign-in. So we have some investigations in progress for us to figure out if we can enhance that to be more reliable and secure, to offer this kind of a mechanism for especially the education sector. We don't have a timeline to provide at this point, but it's an active investigation. That's all we can say. We'll announce it if we get to a point where we can, we can productize it and offer it to customers.
Sure, thank you. So let's see, we've got a couple questions in the chat from Patrick Goggins. Request, actually this is probably just more of a request than a question, but request enterprise app metadata aggregate support with per entity ID attribute release overrides. I don't know if anybody has any comments on that from the panel. If not, we can take that offline and provide feedback.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean the short skinny there is an active investigation underway to identify ways to support things like EduPerson and other identity standards for education with respect to things like attribute release, and that kind of ties back to the all-up approach for application assignment and enterprise application creation. So it is very much an active investigation, but there's no technical capabilities currently in play yet.
Sure. Roger Higgins writes, is there any roadmap for syncing security groups from an on-prem to Azure Active Directory? I'm going to assume that you're talking about expanding from 50,000 user objects. Is that correct, Roger? Because you can already synchronize security groups from on-prem to Azure Active Directory.
Sorry about that. I actually I mistyped it. It's really for group write back.
Oh, group write back.
So I had it reversed.
Gotcha.
Sorry about that.
Is there anybody from the Azure AD team that would like to?
I mean, right now you can only do distribution groups, I believe.
The group write back.
I
think the
groups.
Yeah, I was going to say the group write back is only for on-prem exchange at this point.
I mean, you could do the yeah.
All right, I think maybe that's a question we can bring up on Wednesday when we have the other people from the Azure AD team there.
I'll jump in there.
All right.
This is Brian Arkills. So the limit today actually is 200,000 for group membership. To correct Steve.
Okay.
And that's with the newer any version that's newer than version 2.0 of Azure AD Connect. And you're going to have to move to that version by next June, because the older versions of Azure AD Connect only support the Azure AD Graph, and ADAL, which are being deprecated next June. So just a heads up, get your Azure AD Connect versions updated. the question that was asked about sort of group write back, I know that is something the product team is looking at doing. I don't have at hand where they are in the roadmap, and I can't reveal much more without actually having that information at my hands, because I am obligated to not say much more under NDA.
Yeah, and just a general note on that front, we do have a session tomorrow, the Azure AD Voice of the Customer session, where we will be talking about something we call the Azure AD Customer Community for Education. So any questions that can't be answered today, we will be talking about how we'll handle it moving forward, being able to get questions answered and insights in regards to product roadmap, some of which requires NDA. But feel free to join that session as well.
All right, moving along, we have a question on RBAC. Are there plans to allow admins who have an RBAC role in Intune, not in Azure, to edit security groups? We have found it difficult for techs to move devices from groups to groups as they don't have Azure roles.
I can take the first run at this one. So editing membership of security groups is operating on the directory. Security groups are entities within the directory, and as such, you have to have permission within the directory to modify them or manipulate them. So the way I would interpret this question is customers need some kind of role to edit security groups, and that role would have to be an Azure role of some form. But it sounds like there's a missing level of, I don't know, granularity on what's available in Azure roles today, so that these techs can get only the permission they need on the role, on the groups, to modify the groups they need to. Am I capturing that correctly? At the end of the day, it'll have to be an Azure role of some sort.
Yeah, I think I think whoever asked the question, please go ahead.
It's Niles Wimber.
Yes. Thanks for answering the question. Yeah, I was just curious if that was by design, and it sounds like it is. So we'll just have to look into creating a custom Azure role for them.
Gotcha.
We have from Todd Moat. I constantly use the analogy of a corporate merger when describing how we as a university operate. We may all be at UT, but each college at UT is its own entity and their own IT groups. Moving into the same Intune and maintaining those IT groups' autonomy is proving difficult. I don't know if somebody has anything they'd like to discuss about how we can help Todd in a single Intune instance with multiple schools.
Yeah, maintaining autonomy of lower level organizations within a single Intune tenant is the job of Intune RBAC role delegation and scoping. Intune has a fairly sophisticated set of permissions you can customize, and you can use security groups in combination with Intune scope tags to kind of draw perimeters around the objects that you can manage through Intune. It's a little bit different on the Azure AD side, so I'll defer to Doug to go over that. But we probably would need a bit more detail on the difficulty Todd's facing specifically.
Mostly it's around, mostly it's that, right? The College of Engineering doesn't necessarily need to mess with the devices from the College of Fine Arts, right? So those two places have different ITs and they have different quote unquote business sectors. So, their policies are different. I mean, everything about them is generally different. And so, yes, we have on-prem config manager, and we are tenant attached, but I cannot scope or tag tenant attached devices, right? So I would have to enroll everything in Intune first in order to then divide things into security groups for techs when they log into Intune to only see the things that they're supposed to see. And so right now, when they do that, they see all the tenant attached devices from across the whole university, which it is a hard UI thing for them to manage, right? And so yes, scoping and tagging and grouping does work relatively well, but it's hard to put all of those things together easily. I mean, they're not in the same place, and there's not a whole lot of connective tissue between them to see how that is used, if that makes any sense at all.
Sure. No, I think that makes total sense around the tenant attached devices. That's a well-known gap that we're actively tracking around the ability to apply Intune scope tags to tenant attached devices. Intune RBAC generally, first class support is for the devices directly managed by Intune, and as we've expanded support for kind of just syncing in devices that have different management authorities, in this case on-premises SCCM, we're still working on filling out like the complete support to have them all be brought under the umbrella of the one Intune RBAC system. So yeah, that makes total sense, and we are tracking that. If you haven't already, we could capture your organization's specific scenarios and make sure that gets linked up with our tracking.
Sure.
I think this is Keith Sumlar from the University of Illinois. I think to add on to that point, one of the challenges with Intune RBAC is kind of the way RBAC works and that it's additive. So you tag, the items that you would then kind of delegate to an administrator so they can see all the policy or content or objects. But when you assign RBAC roles, they get all of the abilities delegated to all of that they can see, and there's no like real restriction. And so for us, having some content or some amount of Intune managed separately by, say, central IT, and then making that visible to an administrative user. If they have any kind of modify rights, then they can modify what they can see, which is very undesirable. And so there's a big gap there in terms of usability.
Yes, to add to that, I am currently slicing on-prem config manager into subscriptions where I give the College of Engineering folders and collections and all of the RBAC roles that I can give them to make it as much quote unquote their own space as I can, and translating that from on-prem config manager RBAC to Intune RBAC. That has proved hard, right? For some of the points that Keith said. So, yes, yep. Federation is the thing.
That makes sense. Yeah, this is another well-known ask that we're tracking. So it's very high on my list, specifically advocating for large organizations for our next planning exercise that's coming up here at the beginning of November. So, yep, that makes sense.
All right, the next question from Annie Pender. Where would you recommend a longtime config manager site admin go to learn about why we should be looking to add Intune to the mix? So a beginner at Intune, but not management, not just docs for how to do it technically, but bigger picture, which areas would be a good to start with. And Annie, or Ann, sorry. Do you know, and I've got your email address here, and we can always follow with you offline as well, but do you know who your account team is by any chance? And the reason I ask is because we have some resources in the field that would probably be good for you to sit down and talk to around something like that.
We go through a reseller, but he's pretty responsive, so I can go to him and ask him to get us in touch.
Okay, and if not, we can always follow up too. I'll take that as a follow-up and send a note to you as well.
Okay,
Hey, Steve. Ann is a part of Davidson, which is one of mine. So I will reach out to you, Ann.
Okay. Must
Thank
be
you.
part of MEHEC or
No,
okay.
no, one of them in North Carolina, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's mine.
Gotcha.
Yeah, North Carolina.
There we go. Let's see. So Clayton was answering a question to you, Andy. Hopefully you got that. Robert Jackson writes, policy sets seems to be very limited in what can be added to them. Will they be expanded to allow more types of policies and scripts to be added? And I don't know if we need him to expand on that.
Yeah, specific like concrete types of objects to be looking for, that would be great to capture. I wasn't aware how much EDU generally uses policy sets. There's something that was added a couple years ago to the enterprise console. I'm not an expert in how we've how they're represented in the Intune for Education console, but yeah, specifics around the types of objects or policies would be good.
Yeah, and I was going to say, just remember, even though everybody here is education, I would say a large collection of them are probably not using the Intune for Education console. They are using what the enterprise people would be using.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and Intune for Education, just to clarify, does not expose the concept of policy sets today.
Okay. Sean writes, are there any plans to make managing Intune across multiple tenants easier? For example, since my university has 4 tenants, building applications and policies for deployment would need to be done in each rather than one. Total of 4 are unified in ConfigMan.
Got it. So not me directly, but other folks on my team are taking up the concept of what we're calling multi-tenant organizations, or MTO, or multi-tenant management, MTM. Most of the investments I've been looking at this from the perspective of partners or third parties managing multiple tenants. But this sounds like a slightly different organization where it's not, you don't have a partner relationship, at least not commercially, but this is just, you have multiple tenants in your organization. So I think we want to start with why the multiple tenants are desirable. Is it from an identity perspective, or is it from a management perspective that you find it's necessary to maintain 4 distinct tenants as opposed to?
Oh, believe me, I would love to get rid of the 4 tenants. I think it's a little bit difficult for the university to stomach doing a tenant consolidation or migration at this scale.
And that for technical reasons, or just lack of capability, the amount of effort it would
say
take to unenroll and re-enroll everything?
Political.
Yeah. It would be a gigantic ask to so I'm with the University of Nebraska, so we have how we ended up with 4 tenants is historically all of the campuses were managed independently, and there's now a unified IT instance as far as central IT goes. So we started out with 4 tenants. It would be nice to get them all on one. I would say at this time there's not really much of a political appetite to say, okay, the smaller campuses go unify with the big tenant, just from a pure staffing standpoint, funding the cost that it would take to do that, I think it'd be a difficult ask.
Got it.
I would also like to add to that, a lot of times, and we see this in K through 12 as well, but in higher education as well, where a lot of times central IT is providing a service for a particular campus or college, and rather than, they're not an MSP partner, so they're not going to be able to get the M365 Lighthouse today anyway, but they are providing that partner-like services to the individual schools, and we see that especially in the K through 12, where you have a lot of BOCES and RICs, where they're providing a service for the individual school districts.
Makes sense. But in this particular case, and I'd love to hear the directory folks chime in as well, if we could wave a magic wand and kind of alleviate the technical amount of effort it would take to consolidate tenants having to unenroll and re-enroll devices, or being able to just have all the groups magically appear from one moment to the next in one tenant, are there political / business reasons that would still make it undesirable, even if all the technical functionality made it relatively trivial to collapse tenants?
It would be, yeah, I think we'd have to investigate what the technical ramifications would be at that point to kind of answer that. I mean, if it was, relatively simple, I think that would be one thing. But I mean, today, just purely doing a move of data from one tenant to another tenant in the same cloud, it's, that can be painful in and of itself.
Well, and I think you'd have to solve the RBAC and other problems in order to sort of replicate that functionality and separation you get by having different tenants.
Right, and that is a key difference, because today, even if we could magically and very easily copy or migrate all the devices and users' data into a single tenant, it does fundamentally shift the political or decision-making process. A tenant today is the seat of who has the final say. So if there are 4 tenants, that means all decisions, policy, assignments, and RBAC configurations, everything finally all land at 4 different roots. I think in any future, and directory folks feel free to chime in, but I think in any future where we make multi-tenant management easier or more developed, a single tenant fundamentally means you are granting the central team final say power. And so it's not the same as the partner-customer relationship as in Lighthouse, where the final say ultimately still remains at the kind of broken out local level.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense, and it tends to be how we do manage things. I think somebody earlier had said we essentially kind of treat them as in distributed areas that have distributed IT as sort of a kind of an independent organization almost that partners with us. So today in Configuration Manager, we'll more than likely set as much RBAC policy as possible to effectively kind of give them their own space. But I mean, it's still, I mean, of course, we could still see everything in the system, and if a security policy came down that had to be pushed out, that we reserve the right to do that.
I'm also curious. I'm also curious because we work with a higher ed organization that has acquired multiple universities over time, but they have also spun off some of the acquisitions over time. Is that something that also happens often with folks on this call?
You're talking like spinning off, like essentially startups based on research or grants, or?
Well, more like, as they acquire one university, they will have their university for a period of time, and then a couple of years later, they may, once again, have that university be a completely separate entity, and that was one of the reasons why they wanted to keep the tenants separated, because at any point in time, those entities could become separated again. So I was just curious to see if that's a common scenario among the folks all here.
In 20-something years in higher ed, I've literally never heard of that happening.
Yeah, me
Okay.
neither.
Yeah, could be unique to the customer that we work with in Chicago. Then they tend to be primarily getting schools up and running the correct way, and then later they may become, their own separate entities. So just likely a business model.
I'd only ever heard of that recently when one of our employees actually left to go work for an organization like that.
Okay. Thank you.
But it sounds like, in the case of University of Nebraska, it sounds like in an ideal world, central IT team now should have the final say, and therefore it would be appropriate to collapse it all into the same tenant, both for identity purposes and for device management. And maybe the 4 different campuses still retain their own domain names and their own IT teams. That's all fine. But from an organizational decision-making standpoint, you do want the central IT team to kind of finally have the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, and then use an RBAC system to delegate out power as appropriate.
Correct. And we effectively still do have that. I mean, today, if we were, 100% Intune, it would be me simply logging into 4 different tenants with the same level of Intune administrator access to do the same thing 4 times.
Got it. So are there other folks on the call who are in this same situation? You, for historical or other reasons, have multiple tenants, or you do want to maintain multiple tenants, but as a organizational decision-making hierarchy or system, your central IT team should have the final say of all management across all of these tenants.
I would say yes. At UT Austin, we have 3 or 4 tenants, but they are all controlled by Central today, and the other 3 tenants are used as dev test and qual. But it would be advantageous to be able to affect things in all 4 dev test, qual, and prod.
Yeah, I'll jump in here too. This is Brian from University of Washington, and I would just want to amplify something that Kyle Beckman has put in the comments there, which is relevant to what you asked, Daniel. So often what we will see is that departments will spin up their own Azure AD tenant purely so that they can do Intune. And there's really no way for us to block them from doing that. And this is an open ask I have to the identity team. Joey Cruz, our PM, is very familiar with this. We hate the fact that departments can spin up their own tenants, and we really have no way to prevent it. And once they do that, there's really no way for us to easily get control of that tenant, and B, merge it back into our existing enterprise tenant.
Got it.
So Intune is the problem that's creating Azure AD problems.
And it's the lack of delegation and granular RBAC that creates that problem.
Oh, I see. So it's not as if they weren't aware of what they're doing. They're just saying, look, the central IT team can't create the roles we need, so our only option is to go spin up our own tenant.
Yes. Despite there being an institutional policy against doing that, it's happened at least once.
I see. That's excellent feedback to hear. I don't know if folks from the identity team have any comment on technical controls on restricting the creation of new Azure AD tenants at sounds like it would have to be at the commercial stage or some form of customer verification.
I'll just say that in my conversations with the identity team, there's been a couple things that we've talked about. You can put in, we could add accepted domains to our existing tenant. The problem with that is that there's a hard limit to how many accepted domains you can have. And of course, we have far more domains than that limit. What we've asked instead is that there be an ability to do a wildcard and say, hey, everything under washington.edu or under uw.edu is considered part of this tenant. And we haven't gotten much movement on that, but it is being considered by the product team.
And it still doesn't help us because then a department can just go create a .org or something and still spin up their own tenant. It really fundamentally comes back to the delegation in RBAC.
And it sounds like Intune's the only motive that's been driving this so far. There hasn't been this coming up in the context of any other M365 service. I was thinking Teams or OneDrive or any of the other sorts of services that a lower org needs to be scoped properly or RBAC'd properly, but for lack of that, they just go off and create their own tenant.
Right, because OneDrive, Teams, Exchange Online, are all readily provided central services that meet the needs and don't really have RBAC requirements that would drive departmental units to go do something. Device management is really where we see that that need.
Going back to Brian's point about people spinning up tenants and adding Intune. So Intune and rest of those require a license. And I know that I've seen other schools work with their resellers to basically say that, hey, nobody can buy other than central IT and it has to be approved first. This way they can't have no way to actually purchase those services beforehand.
They just need an institutional credit card, and at least at the University of Washington, lots and lots of people have those.
Okay. Yeah, we've had those conversations with our account team, and it just seems they find ways to work around it. And also, Microsoft will give them grants. So the tenant that we mentioned before that got spin up with Intune licenses, well, those Intune licenses were given to that department via grant.
Got it. This is all great feedback to hear. Perhaps we should move on and see if there's other aspects of this or other topics.
Sure. Let's see. From Kyle, the two things we are seeing are department is able, basically just what we were talking about. From Christopher Clayton, I can't imagine inquiring or spinning up off a public sector higher ed. I've heard there are rare instances. I think there's people just no, everybody was just commenting on the last thing. So let's see. So can I get a Windows 11 hardware readiness insight from my devices in Endpoint Manager?
Right, very timely question, Steve. With now Windows 11 being released, we just recently released the ability to get Windows 11 insights from work from anywhere reporting Endpoint Analytics. So now we can quickly drill down to see which devices that are enrolled in Intune meet the requirements, so you know which ones are ready and what kind of blockers you have in your organization.
Cool. I think I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but we had somebody present on Windows Update for Business within Intune, and I believe she had actually went over that a little bit during her session as well. So if you want a little bit more detail, look to the session yesterday morning on that. And we have another question here. How can I control when compatible devices get an upgrade to Windows 11?
Yeah, so I suspect that if you covered the endpoint analytics, Windows 11 hardware readiness, that this was also covered, but we've also recently added the ability to select Windows 11 as part of a Windows update, Windows feature update in the Intune. So now you're able, just like you were before with Windows 10, that you could control which version of Windows you wanted your devices to go up to and stay. You can do the same thing for the devices that are able to move. You can configure the policy to have them move to Windows 11 if they're on a hardware that's able to move to it.
All right. I don't see any more questions. Anybody want to call off mute? Anybody want to ask any more questions of the panel?
Yes, I had one follow-up question to that one about Windows 11 just now.
Sure.
If I have in Endpoint Manager configured a update ring for Windows 10 devices, and I've got a 6-month deferral on feature updates as part of that policy or that update ring, will that mean that in 6 months from October 5th, I'll start getting Windows 11 upgrades, or do I need to explicitly do something to either allow that or stop that?
That is a great question. Typically, and I believe that's the same behavior with Windows 11, somebody else can chime in as well. But generally speaking, once your deferrals have expired, you are now up to getting the next version of the OS that comes after. But because Windows 10 is going to have a concurrent release of Windows 10 up to a certain amount of time, you will likely be getting the next release of Windows 10, right, until that stops. And then once that cadence of Windows 10 updates stop, we'll have to figure out at that point, right? Because the next release would then be Windows 11. But for now, because there'll be concurrent releases of 10 and 11, the deferrals will likely put you in to the next Windows 10 release rather than moving you over to Windows 11, unless your Windows Update feature is explicitly set to move you to Windows 11.
And I believe Julie actually talked about that as well in her presentation. And I think she did mention exactly what Carlos mentioned, that the Windows 11 will not, if you have your deferral set, it's not going to be Windows 11 the next time around. It's going to be the next version of Windows 10. And if you needed to get Windows 11, then you would actually have to specifically go in and do something. And I wasn't following 100% along the conversation, but that's what she was mentioning. We also have a question from Jeffrey. Any idea why most of my devices showing unknown for Windows 11 readiness status? And Richard actually put a screenshot of what Endpoint Analytics looks like, and lo and behold, a lot of his say unknown in there as well.
Yeah, one thing to check in that is it could simply just be that those devices are inactive. So just kind of verify if that's actually something that's happening. You can check on the last check-in time for some of those devices to see if that's truly what the reason as to why those devices are reporting as unknown.
Gotcha. And Richard just mentioned that Windows 11 is opt-in, not opt-out, like we had when we moved from 7 to Windows 10. So. And thank you, Caden. Caden just put the link to the survey in there, so please do fill out the survey so we can get feedback on the panel. And Brian is putting some note that group right back V2s in private preview. And some links to the follow-up. Last call for questions. All right. I guess thank you to the panel for spending your time with us. It was very informative. Thank you for everybody that answered questions, asked questions. It was good to listen to. At this point, I'm going to stop recording.